This is a map that shows where most people in the United States live. But at first glance, it might look like a map showing where no one in the United States lives. After all, aside from a few major cities, the entire country appears completely empty. And that's because for a lot of Americans, much of their country looks exactly like this. So why do so few Americans live west of this line? Hello, and welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to take a look at this weird line that cuts across the United States and find out why 80% of Americans live east of it. First things first, if you're new here, I make videos about geography. So if you like that kind of thing, consider subscribing. Also, I just made a video where I explained why the entire country of Italy sits atop this weird line. So if you haven't seen that yet, definitely go watch it now. Anyways, let's get into today's video. First, we need to take a closer look at this line. It's not actually a real line. It's just an approximation. But there's something pretty interesting about it. When you look closely, you can see that it follows roughly along a line of latitude. But instead of being horizontal, it slants diagonally across the continent. If we look at another map, we can see that this slanted line is approximately the 100th meridian west. Meridians are lines of longitude that run vertically from the North Pole to the South Pole. Each of them is separated by 6 degrees, and this particular one is the 100th meridian west, meaning it is 100 degrees west of the prime meridian. So what's so important about this line? Why do people seem to stop populating the land west of it? Well, first off, it's not really true that people stop existing west of this line. There are several large cities west of it like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Denver. But it is true that most Americans live east of it. In fact, 82% of Americans live east of the 98th meridian, which is even more strict than the 100th meridian. That means that only 18% of Americans live in states that are entirely west of this line. As far as population distribution goes, the American population is very concentrated east of this line. To put this into perspective, 100% of Americans live east of the 122nd meridian, and 100% of Americans live north of the 23rd parallel. But less than 100% of Americans live east of the 98th meridian and south of the 49th parallel. In other words, it's impossible to live anywhere in the contiguous United States and not be further east than the 98th meridian or further north than the 49th parallel, but it's possible to live somewhere in the contiguous United States and be further south than the 49th parallel and further west than the 98th meridian. And it's not just Americans that tend to live east of this line. We can find a similar pattern almost everywhere else in the world. Much of the Earth's surface is dominated by huge stretches of empty land away from the planet's largest cities and towns. And almost always there seems to be some straight line that divides the settled world from the empty world. And so when we look at a map of nighttime light, which is a good proxy for where people live, we can clearly see this dividing line between the part of the world that is well populated and the part of the world that is empty. Now, this line isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it curves, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to stick with straight lines for this video. So let's take a closer look at the rest of the world's dividing lines. Here, we can see the dividing line in Europe. It runs through France, Germany, Poland, and Ukraine. Here, we can see the dividing line in Africa. It runs through Algeria, Mali, Niger, and Sudan. Here, we can see the dividing line in Asia. It runs through China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. Here we can see the dividing line in Australia. It runs right down the middle of the continent. But what about the Americas? Well, aside from the United States, this line runs through Mexico, Central America, and South America. But it also runs through Canada. In fact, if we pan back over to the United States and Canada, we can see that the line is actually the border between the two countries. In other words, this line has a lot of different meanings. For some countries, it's a linguistic boundary. In others, it's a religious boundary. In others, it's an economic boundary, and in others, it's a political boundary. In the case of the United States and Canada, it's both a linguistic and political boundary. But there are some interesting aspects of the U.S.-Canada border that tie it to our original dividing line. First, Canada's population is much more evenly distributed along this border. No Canadian province has more than 10% of the country's population, and only 2 provinces have more than 5% of the population. Compare that to the United States, and we can see that the distribution of population is much more concentrated east of the 98th meridian. In fact, 3 states account for more than half of the country's population. That's a much higher degree of concentration than we see in Canada. So why do Canadians live more evenly distributed along the border with the United States, while Americans live so much more concentrated east of the 98th meridian? Well, it might have something to do with the fact that the United States is a much larger country than Canada. To be more specific, the United States is a much wider country than Canada. From east to west, the United States spans roughly 3,000 miles. Meanwhile, Canada spans roughly 2,000 miles. That means that everything being equal, Americans are on average further away from the center of the country than Canadians are, and that might explain why they tend to settle closer to that center. But the relationship between population distribution and physical size isn't the only interesting aspect of this line. It also relates to biodiversity. To be more specific, it relates to tree diversity. Not all trees live in the same places. Some trees can only be found in the eastern part of the country, while others can only be found in the western part of the country. And when we overlay a map of tree types onto the United States, we can clearly see the effect of this line. The most common type of tree in the central part of the country is the oak, and oaks are typically found east of the 98th meridian. The most common type of tree in the western part of the country is the pine, and pines are typically found west of the 98th meridian. That means that if you travel from New York City to Seattle, you'll start off surrounded by oaks, and the further west you travel, the more pines you'll start to see, until eventually all the oaks are gone, and there are only pines. Or, to put it another way, if you want to see the most amount of different types of trees, you should travel north-south along this line. Take a look at any north-south line within the United States, and you'll see that there are different types of trees on either side of this line. And that's because this line marks a transition zone between 2 different climates, the humid climate of the east and the dry climate of the west. It's the same reason that so many different kinds of animals live in this region. In fact, this area is home to more animal species than any other place in the United States. So, what's the significance of this line? Why does it divide the United States into 2 separate regions? And why do Americans live so much more concentrated east of it? Well, the answer to these questions is complicated and probably involves a combination of factors. Some scholars believe that this line traces the boundary between 2 different ways of life in North America. On the one side, there is a more rural way of life. Farming and ranching are important, and cities are relatively small. On the other side, there is an increasingly urban way of life. Manufacturing and services are important, and cities are massive. Over time, the 2 sides have grown further apart and today are home to different populations with different cultures, values, and lifestyles. Others believe that this line follows the boundary between the 2 different climates in North America. On the one side, there is a wetter climate with more rainfall and humidity. On the other side, there is a drier climate with less rainfall and humidity. Over time, the 2 climates have pushed against each other, and where they meet, we get this line. And since people tend to prefer living in wetter climates, they've settled mostly east of this line. Whatever the reason, this line is one of the most significant lines in geography. It cuts across continents and oceans and divides the Earth into 2 separate halves. On one side, we have the developed world. On the other side, we have the developing world. It's a dividing line between rich and poor, between developed and developing, between urban and rural, and it's one of the most important dividing lines on Earth. I hope you enjoyed learning about this line. If you did, please subscribe. And, as always, thanks for watching.